I'm a first-timer at this conference, but I hope to make many happy returns, and I'm also a first-timer to Las Cruces, and so far there's 5 stars all around for the conference and for Las Cruces. It's been a great event for me. Since Wayne mentioned that I'm a microbial ecologist, I feel obligated to get my science nerd credentials in. So today is the 10th day of the 10th month. So today is Happy Angstrom Day to everyone out there. Any followers of the Angstrom? No. Okay. We'll move on. So I'm here today to talk to you about the International Space Station National Laboratory, which you've been hearing about from a multitude of speakers, including Ken in his talk he just completed. And everyone, I think, understands what the International Space Station is, and I think each of us brings to that understanding, that knowledge, a slightly different perspective on why the International Space Station exists, what its value is for our nation currently, and how important or critical it is to the transition to what comes next, including our ambitions to go to the moon, to go to Mars, and go beyond. The International Space Station National Laboratory and the International Space Station itself represent opportunities as R&D platforms, first and foremost. They enable us to put together technologies to demonstrate their ability to perform and sustain a human presence in space, and enable us to develop those new technologies that we need in order to go beyond low Earth orbit. It's also important to note that this laboratory enables us to foster scientific discovery that has direct applications here on Earth. Now, everything that NASA has done for the nation in advancing our ambitions to maintain a human presence in space and discover what our universe looks like has enabled technology discovery and innovation here on Earth. Some of it has a shorter lead time in getting back to Earth than others. So one aspect, one unique viewpoint of the International Space Station National Laboratory is to shorten that chain from access to space to Earth benefit. Why space? From the perspective of the International Space Station National Laboratory, we look at space as an opportunity to benefit life on Earth. So there are very important parts of the NASA research portfolio which will continue to attract considerable amounts of funding over the next few years through the life of the International Space Station to address technology goals that enable us to maintain that human presence off Earth. At the same time, the International Space Station National Laboratory was conceived as an opportunity to engage research and technology development that, although does not directly address those exploration goals, can also benefit those goals. So the direction that the International Space Station National Laboratory looks at in building its portfolio is to look at science that is enabled by that unique access to the space environment. Everyone here, I'm sure, is familiar with microgravity. So the way that we at the International Space Station National Laboratory seek out to bring new to space customers and existing space customers to the International Space Station National Laboratory is to enable them to make that connection in their imagination to what they're doing within their own R&D programs and how access to space can benefit that. So one viewpoint from the perspective of the International Space Station and its operating environment is obviously the persistent microgravity environment. We all have now access to different timelines to use that microgravity environment. The International Space Station National Laboratory and the free flyers that are becoming available are the current platforms that enable you for that persistent exposure to the microgravity environment. In addition to many of the things about physics being good ideas, we all know that they're actually laws, and those laws of physics are upended in the absence of gravity. That not only has direct implications for material systems, it directly impacts biological systems as well. And some of those impacts on the biology and the material science are actually beneficial to processes here on Earth to better explore ways to better manufacture devices made from novel materials, or to better understand the onset and progression of diseases because they are accelerated by the exposure of biology to that environment. Another aspect is the extreme environment of space. You heard from Made in Space, from Andrew Rush yesterday, talking about the interest in looking at thermal vacuum chambers and building systems that can operate in an environment for manufacturing. The first initial test cases for those are going to be materials and habitats and machines that are of interest to the space program and extending the human presence in space. But not far behind that will certainly follow additive manufacturing practices that have advantages here on Earth as well. Alpha Space is another major player who offers the ability to test materials in that exposure environment. So we've seen a significant increase from commercial entities in utilizing that accelerated degradation environment for materials that are not even going to be designed to necessarily operate in that environment, but they're simply looking to get to their failure points earlier in the degradation cycle. Another aspect is the unique vantage point. So at its basis, the International Space Station and the National Laboratory there serve as remote sensing observation platforms. They have the advantage of being crewed systems in that you're enabled to test remote sensing technologies that can be deployed, collect data, and then removed and returned to Earth for further analysis. You also have on the International Space Station the ability not only to look back at Earth, to look back at us, but to look deeper into space. So the alpha magnetic spectrometer that was flown up to the International Space Station on the last shuttle mission continues to operate and offers insight into the origins of the universe and dark matter. Managing the space. So this is a very busy chart with a lot of acronyms in it. And I'm hoping that none of the questions come in and ask me to name all the, I actually can, but we'll talk about them. So one of the important things to keep in mind is from its creation, the International Space Station has always been a multi-user facility. In addition to the international partners, each of the international partners and the space agency supporting them have always had multiple layers of interest in access to low Earth orbit for addressing issues of concern to their space programs. Within the current construct on the International Space Station, that space allocation is divided between NASA utilization, which accounts for about 40%, and is divided among several programs: Human Exploration Operation Mission Directorate, Science Mission Directorate, and the Space Technology Mission Directorate. Within HEOMD, the Human Exploration Operations Mission Directorate, there are multiple programs that all have continuing programs, both for commercial and private entities, that generate significant revenue through the supply side for maintaining hardware and facilities to perform those investigations, as well as opportunities for funding to investigators to address technical gaps in our ability to understand what's going on within the portfolios of each of those programs. The ones that I've bolded under there, HRP is Human Research Program, the ISS Technology Demonstration Mission, which includes the Department of Defense Space Technology Program, and Space Life and Physical Sciences Research Applications. We also have the international partners who continue to perform research and fly crew members up to the International Space Station, represented by Canadian Space Agency, European Space Agency, and the Japanese Exploration Agency. On the other side of the circle is the International Space Station US National Laboratory. Our 40% of that space includes on-orbit crew time, up mass, down mass, power, stowage, data and communications, and crew training. This is the carrot that we have at the International Space Station National Laboratory to offer to new-to-space investigators, as well as anyone else who has an R&D question that can benefit from access to space. Just this June, as Mary Lynn Dittmar described yesterday, NASA opened up a smaller wedge of that pie for purely commercial, non-R&D directed activities. So NASA is now moving into the era where they will allow commercial access to the International Space Station for the performance of activities that are purely commercial. They don't have to be directed towards addressing a research or technology development goal. So the International Space Station National Laboratory has been in existence since 2011. And in that time, we've been very successful in identifying sources of demand for access to space and helping to increase the supply funnel that enables facilities and access to R&D on board the International Space Station. We have over 126 projects from academic, nonprofit, and other government agency institutions, 153 industry projects that include not only the users of the International Space Station, but the suppliers of those services on board the International Space Station. We've been also successful in leveraging additional funding both for the users of the International Space Station and again for those that supply facilities and services to serve that sector. We've also seen a steady increase in the number of commercial laboratory facilities that are available on board the International Space Station for supporting these R&D activities. Fortunately, this is not a hockey stick graph, so I can avoid the stern look from Mary Lynn Dittmar. We don't expect to see a hockey stick increase at the end of the number of facilities. But more importantly, we do see a continual and steady increase in the number of commercial service providers who are defining new capabilities that serve not only the interest of the International Space Station and the space programs, but just as importantly serve the interest of the commercial and academic sectors that fulfill the portfolio for the ISS National Laboratory. We're also seeing a continual increase in access to resources. So on the left, you see the crew time utilization hours in green, on the right, the number of payloads delivered. The green on the right only has data for fiscal year 19 through the third quarter. We now have the fourth quarter data, but we're playing with the numbers a little bit to make sure they're accurate before I report them here. But I wanted to point out the all-important asterisk or star that's at the top of that column. So in the increment pair just completed, the crew on board the International Space Station set a new records for the amount of time spent on performing not only NASA-sponsored science, but also International Space Station National Laboratory-sponsored science. So in the last increment pair, which dates from about March to October 3rd of this year, the crew performed over 703 hours of science investigations that were sponsored by the International Space Station and National Laboratory. So we continue to set new records each year in identifying users of the International Space Station who seek to utilize the space environment and that unique environment there for furthering their R&D development goals. We also see growth across all the sectors, both academic and nonprofit institutions, as well as government-sponsored investigations, and most importantly, commercial access to space. We continue to see a growth across all the sectors. We initially focused a lot of our attention on the life sciences sector, and we've now expanded that to include more of an interest in the physical sciences sector. And we're continuing to see that increase as well. So as I stand before you today, we continue to build the business case for space-based R&D. It's been slower, I think, than anyone would have wished or thought at the beginning. But we now have focused programs that are enabling investigators to perform the gamut of science from basic and applied R&D activities all the way through translational, even clinical applications for life sciences. We're continuing to develop that through flexible collaboration models. So Mary Lynn again spoke yesterday about the significant value in forming teams. Now, sometimes in the commercial world, it's difficult to form teams. But we found that there are questions which are common across industries, across institutions, that have unique application in the space environment. So we're seeing the formation, organic formation of alliances to address these issues, which we can then leverage to utilize to inform capability gaps, things that are needed on the International Space Station and in low Earth orbit moving forward to address the concerns of those R&D portfolios. As I mentioned, we've seen this steady and continual increase in the number of facilities and capabilities on board the International Space Station. So we continue at the International Space Station National Laboratory to work closely not only with our colleagues at NASA, but with the commercial service providers and the implementation partners who are building the technologies and the platforms that are addressing these new research needs. In 2019, we announced the formation of two new program areas, which are continuations of previous efforts in each of these areas through partnerships with other federal agencies, including the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health, as well as important collaborations we've had with industry. What we announced in 2019 was focusing those efforts in two particular areas: one, advanced materials and manufacturing; the second one in industrialized biomedicine. Why? Because the laws of physics have serious and direct implications upon the formation of materials and their interactions in that environment, and these translate directly to life science changes. So we've seen to date over 37 payloads flown in the advanced materials area with participation, as I mentioned, with funding from National Science Foundation. And we're seeing more and more interest from the commercial sector in the use of materials case studies, material science investigations on board the International Space Station to address issues of concern. One of those you heard about briefly in Andrew Rush's comments yesterday is in the area of heavy metal glasses, ZBLAN. In the area of biomedicine, we've seen several projects sponsored not only by NIH and NSF as well, but also by Department of Defense and commercial companies, both large and small pharma. We have over $32 million in committed grants for multi-year programs in partnership with the National Institutes of Health and NSF that have generated over 20 payloads and 20 publications to date. We have also, since 2017, had partnerships with a couple of the institutes at the National Institutes of Health to support cutting-edge research in tissue chip technology, organ on chips. This has gone through 2 rounds of funding, which began in 2017 with the announcement of 5 tissue on chip projects and 4 more in tissue chips 2 in 2018. We've already successfully flown 5 of those payloads. So in 2017, the awards were announced. By the middle of 2019, 5 of them had already flown once. This program is unique in that we structured it so that each of the principal investigators has 2 flight opportunities. So again, the International Space Station National Laboratory is seeking to cut that amount of time between innovation, idea, and flight so that you actually do have the opportunity to iterate your science in the space environment. Also this year, in this past year, we saw a significant increase in the number of bioprinting capabilities on orbit. The Russians in December flew a device that's able to fly organoids and position them in space using magnetic positioning. Alevi has announced plans in partnership with Made in Space to fly a bioprinter. And TechShot just completed operation and validation of their biofabrication facility in a flight this summer. I mentioned pharmaceutical companies. So pharmaceutical companies not only seek to identify new drugs and new drug candidates, they also seek to continually improve the efficacy of the drugs that are already in existence and have been through clinical trials. One approach is to change the precipitation conditions under which you make those chemicals so that they have better therapeutic use. We've seen Merck scientist Paul Reichert explore this capability on station, and that Merck science has moved beyond drug discovery to actually looking at improving the quality of a drug that's already in clinical use in the United States. That drug is Keytruda. So as Ken mentioned, low Earth orbit and the International Space Station serves as a catalyst that's available to you to accelerate the industrialization of space. Some of us at this meeting have used commercialization, so I wanted to take just a few minutes or a few seconds to talk about this. Commercialization is not a bad word, but it's not a good enough word, and it's not a good enough goal either. So about the same time that the International Space Station assembly began, there was a big box store in the United States called Blockbuster Video. Does everybody remember Blockbuster? They had over 4,000 stores in operation in the US, and their technology was the video cassette on your left. They've gone from 4,000 stores down to 1 lonely remaining store, now in Bend, Oregon, which still has its door opens. So a focus on commercialization without paying attention to changes in disruptive technologies does not benefit the economy. So in thinking about space, the ISS National Laboratory, we've adopted the term industrialization. So what we're seeking to have the International Space Station National Laboratory act as a catalyst for is an extensive reorganization of the space economy, with those initial steps being for the purposes of manufacturing, because those are where the sustainable funding is going to come from venture capitalists and angel investors, and where we will see continued growth in interest and alliances between those who are willing to forego the difficulties of working in that in-space environment, because the benefits of their access to that environment inform their R&D portfolio. So the ISS National Laboratory is the only national laboratory that operates at about 8 kilometers a second off the planet, but it's only a launch and a few hours away. Innovation at orbital velocity awaits. Isn't it time to accelerate your business R&D? Thanks. Thank you, Pat.
Great job. Don't go anywhere. So,
We've got questions.
we do. This audience, they really are a part of the show. It's an important part of our show. And what I want you to know, get a load of this, what I want you to know, and everybody, we capture these questions and they will be up on Mike's session post-ISPCS. So would you ever go back and review some?
Sure.
Yeah. That's why
Be
we
glad to.
capture them. So we do, these will all be posted on our website, all these questions from all the sessions by sometime next week after everybody catches up on sleep, etc. So here we go.
Question one.
What?
First question. Okay, number one.
Sounds like, okay, this one's kind of a softball.
Oh, good.
In your opinion, what is the most groundbreaking discovery on ISS? That's like asking you which one of your kids you like best.
Yes, yeah. And my kids aren't listening, so I'll say it's the second one. No. Sure. Yeah, so that is a difficult question to answer. Looking at it from putting an engineer's hat on, the ability to live and operate in that environment is impressive. It's as daunting a task as we faced in Apollo and beyond. Looking at it from a scientist perspective, it's early stage yet, but I am very excited by the early returns we've seen from the tissue-on-chip technologies.
Excellent.
And the ability to translate what we learn from there to animal models, which we all know have limitations. So I look for significant advances coming from there in the next 2 to 3 years.
I'm going to try and follow up. I'm going to stick with a couple of more science questions here. Do you believe that there is a role for the International Space Station National Lab to look at not only dark energy but dark matter? Is there any role that we could use the National Lab?
That one's easy to answer, yes. But keep in mind, I'm a microbiologist, and that's a long way from being a physicist who would actually be able to answer that question. But the results from alpha magnetic spectrometer have been nothing short of amazing. Samuel Ting, who fought so very hard to have that facility installed on the International Space Station, I think has far exceeded even the amount of science that he and his team thought they would generate. The alpha magnetic spectrometer, like the International Space Station itself, is an international collaboration. It involves significant billion-dollar investments from many nations, and I think it has been worth it. And from the perspective of an R&D, it's a platform that will continue to inform us. It's been in operation now for a little over 5 years, and we'll be doing a series of spacewalks to increase the battery capacity and computing capacity on it to have it continue for the life of International Space Station. So absolutely yes.
Let's just talk about communication so people can follow the research. If you were somebody that is notionally interested in sort of exploring what's going on in the research on the ISS, what would you recommend people in this audience do?
So there are a lot of resources. As I'm sure you're all familiar, there's no shortage of NASA websites, but The International Space Station actively updates the Space Station Research Explorer, which covers R&D activities that are sponsored not only by NASA, but by the International Space Station National Laboratory, including the commercial activities. So there's up-to-date information there on the science that's going on. Also, please check out ISSNationalLaboratory.org. We maintain a blog. We have a quarterly news magazine. There's a variety of ways for you to stay up to date on the payloads that are upgoing on the International Space Station. We also have a very active social media presence. So members of the science team, members of our science communications team, member of the operations team continually update that information, which we are allowed to share for the customers. And there are customers who don't want all that information shared, so we don't share it. But most of it is provided through a variety of resources available to you.
To clarify, the ISS National Lab, CASIS, Center for Science and Space, is a 501c3 corporation. They are separate from NASA, which is why I asked the question, so that you understand it is a separate organization.
Sure.
So we're going to do a little organizational discussion here. And let's go into what is the status of the independent review on the ISS National Lab that Sox mentioned, and then
They're actively working. It's my understanding that the panel has been formed. They have access to information that's provided to them by NASA on the cooperative agreement, which is the legal agreement between CASIS, the 501c3 that I work for, and NASA itself that describes the nature of the relationship, that describes the level of resources that are available for that purpose of having the International Space Station National Laboratory operate in that environment. The timeline for them is, I think, pretty close to what Ken was talking about with the selection of the new AA. It's supposed to be concluded before the end of the calendar year or by the end of the calendar year or possibly sooner.
Okay, I'm going to ignore this question about paying the board members just to give you a break, unless you want to address it. Otherwise, we will buzz over to, do you foresee the creation of commercial space stations? So Bob Bigelow has spoken here, and that picture on the back of the program is the first time Bob Bigelow was here in 2009, so that was 10 years ago. Do you know, and we know the beam is up there, and Bigelow is actually a very curious person, and also looking at free flyers. What do you see regarding the creation of commercial space stations for research and development, technology and exploration? What policies are in place that dictate what kinds of research would be allowed and who has access? You know, that's a lot of stuff in there.
Yeah, some of that's going to take some conversation over the break, but the big questions there, access to new facilities, new capabilities, attaching to and in the same orbital inclination as the International Space Station are extremely valuable. We are limited on the International Space Station in access to resources. Part of that slide with managing space was to show that the International Space Station is an extremely large facility. It has the pressurized volume roughly of a 747, but it's very full, it's very active. So for some activities that require use of chemicals that may have off-gas hazards, it's not the ideal environment for doing that. For biological science experiments that require high numbers of samples or organisms, it's not an ideal environment. So commercial service providers and commercial implementation partners, as well as visionaries like Bob Bigelow and folks at Axiom, are looking at ways to fill those gaps so that you can increase the throughput capacity and perhaps perform some R&D activities that we can't currently perform in the shirt sleeve environment on board the station.
I'm going to stay with that theme. I don't want to let you off stage, though we do want to talk a little bit about remote sensing. But regarding this question here, what do you think is going to be new station developed tech that will soon be the basis for successful startup ventures? So in case anybody from Wall Street is here, like I know Bloomberg is here, so can you predict the future?
No.
Not yet, huh? Oh, well, bummer. Anyway, whatever you want to do in answering that question.
I did have a crystal ball, but I mentioned my favorite child, number 2. Number 1 last had the crystal ball, so that's why I'm a little, no. like I mentioned before with favorite science, tissue on chips, I think, is going to translate into some very important discoveries. And access to station is only one part of that program that the National Institutes of Health is currently funding and that DARPA has funded in the past. So I think we're going to continue to see some significant advances coming from there in the near term. As I mentioned, there are 3 commercial entities that are currently working on the heavy metal glasses, and there are opportunities there for that market to actually present a business case where you could cover the cost of launching the raw materials and manufacturing that optical fiber in orbit because it is so valuable. The three institutions, the 3 companies that are working on that right now are, in early phase discovery and defining what they need to do to manufacture that. Getting to an actual manufacturing system is going to take a little bit more time, but it's going to be here sooner than we think.
Okay, this is the countdown. Short story on remote sensing here. What do you think ISS offers that's compelling and unique and compared to responsive programs like Planet's capabilities?
Yeah, so we've had conversations with companies who are in the business of developing algorithms for converting data into useful information for farmers for sustainable agriculture. So there's a large interest in utilizing drones. There's a large interest in using other free flyer platforms. Some of the advantages you have with the International Space Station is that you have the ability to image the same spot on Earth about every 3 to 5 days under different lighting conditions. So there are some advantages that come along with some disadvantages in doing that. So in thinking about use of the International Space Station as a remote Earth observation platform, it really gets down to what the criteria and test objectives are for that particular design. But we've seen interest, as I mentioned, from folks who are working in data fusion, algorithm development, as well as sensor development, companies that are developing new optical sensors where they want to test them in the space environment and then recover the materials to see ways to improve their utility in that working environment.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well done.
Thank you.
Very, very good job.
Thank you.